The millionaire CEO pushed his secretary too far until one kiss exposed his hidden fear. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Ethan Carter stood at the head of the glass conference table on the 48th floor, Manhattan, stretching out beneath the windows like a quiet promise he never believed in. His tailored suit immaculate, his voice measured, every word clipped with precision as if emotions were inefficiencies to be eliminated. Across from him, Lily Monroe sat perfectly straight with a legal pad balanced on her knees, pen poised, shoulders still, the practiced calm of someone who had learned how to survive pressure without letting it show. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished wood, the kind of place where mistakes felt heavier, where silence carried weight, and Ethan used that silence like a weapon without ever raising his voice. He asked for numbers she had already delivered, questioned decisions he himself had approved, and corrected her phrasing mid-sentence, each interruption landing with surgical accuracy. Lily answered every question, adjusted every note, and apologized once too often, not because she was wrong, but because she understood the rules of proximity to power. Outside the room, assistants moved quietly, phones buzzing, heels tapping softly on carpet, but inside, time seemed to narrow to the distance between Ethan's gaze and Lily's steady breathing. He paced once, stopped behind her chair, and spoke again, lower now, controlled, insisting on perfection while pushing past reason, past professionalism, past the invisible line she had guarded for months. Lily felt her fingers tighten around the pen, the ink bleeding slightly where the tip pressed too hard into the page, her pulse steady but louder in her ears, not from fear, but from the effort of holding herself together. She had stayed late too many nights, skipped meals, walked 6 blocks in the rain when her car broke down, all to keep this machine running smoothly, and still, it was never enough. Ethan paused, eyes narrowing, as if searching for something he could not name, and for a brief moment the mask slipped, revealing exhaustion etched beneath authority, a flicker of something like panic quickly buried. He corrected her again, closer now, invading her space without touching, his shadow crossing her notes, and Lily finally looked up, meeting his eyes with a calm that surprised even her. The room held its breath. She did not raise her voice, did not accuse, did not plead. She simply said she needed clarity to do her job well, that pressure without direction only created mistakes, and that she was committed to excellence, but not at the cost of her dignity. The words were simple, steady, and impossible to ignore. Ethan stiffened, the familiar walls snapping back into place. Authority reasserted with a single sharp breath as he dismissed the meeting and turned away, ending the conversation without resolution. Lily gathered her things slowly, her movements precise, refusing to rush, refusing to crumble, and as she walked out into the hallway, the weight she carried shifted, settling into something heavier but clearer. Behind the closed glass door, Ethan remained alone, staring at the city, jaw clenched, heart racing for reasons he refused to examine. Because control had always kept him safe, and the thought that he might have gone too far felt more dangerous than any market crash. In that quiet room, surrounded by everything money could buy, Ethan Carter stood still, unaware that the line he had just crossed would soon force him to face the one fear he had spent his life running from. Lily Monroe did not go straight home after leaving the office that night, not because she wanted to linger in the city, but because her small apartment felt too quiet for the thoughts crowding her chest. So she walked 6 blocks past the subway entrance and into a 24-hour grocery store where the lights were too bright and the air smelled faintly of detergent and baked bread, a place where no one knew her name or her job title. She picked up a carton of milk she did not really need, checked the price twice, and put it back, reminding herself that every dollar still mattered. Her phone buzzed with a reminder she had set weeks ago, a pharmacy refill, her mother's name flashing on the screen, and Lily closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath the same way she always did when the weight pressed too hard. Her mother's medical bills had not disappeared just because Lily worked for one of the most powerful men in the city, and the numbers did not care how polished the office was or how high the building rose. Rent was due in 10 days. Student loans still followed her like a shadow, and the thin margin she lived within left no room for mistakes or emotional collapse. At home, she kicked off her shoes, set her bag carefully on the chair, and placed her neatly folded blazer over the back as if tomorrow still mattered, because it did. She heated leftover soup, sat at the small table by the window, and stared at the skyline she could barely see from this angle, thinking about how strange it was to serve someone whose life existed in penthouses and private cars while hers measured distance in bus stops and grocery aisles. Lily had taken the job 2 years ago believing professionalism would protect her, that if she worked harder, stayed calmer, and anticipated every need, respect would naturally follow. But tonight forced her to admit something she had avoided naming. She was not afraid of long hours or high expectations. She was afraid of losing herself slowly, quietly, in the space where gratitude turned into silence and silence turned into permission. She replayed the meeting in her mind, not his words, but the moment she spoke back, the calm certainty in her own voice, and how it felt like reclaiming something essential. Lily did not hate Ethan Carter, and that truth complicated everything, because she could see the exhaustion behind his control, the tension in his shoulders when the room went quiet, the way his eyes searched for order as if chaos lived just beneath his skin. Still, understanding did not erase responsibility, and empathy did not pay bills if the line was crossed again. She opened her laptop and reviewed her savings, calculating how long she could manage if she had to walk away. The numbers sobering but not impossible, and that realization steadied her more than fear ever had. The next morning, Lily arrived early as she always did, placed a cup of hot tea on Ethan's desk instead of coffee, because she had noticed it helped when his hands trembled slightly, and organized the day with the same precision she brought to everything else. But something inside her had shifted. She was no longer just surviving proximity to power, she was deciding what it would cost to stay. When Ethan entered, jacket already off, eyes sharp but unfocused, Lily greeted him evenly, her posture relaxed, her voice steady, and for the first time since she started working for him, she understood that the stakes were not only about keeping a job or pleasing a boss. They were about choosing whether to remain in a place that demanded excellence without care, or to insist, quietly and firmly, that dignity was not negotiable, even when the price felt terrifying. Lily settled into the rhythm of her days with quiet intention, not changing what she did on the surface, but deepening the care beneath it, because she understood now that consistency could be a form of strength. Every morning, she arrived before the city fully woke, the elevator ride smooth and silent, the office still dim, and she began with small, deliberate rituals that no one had asked for, but everyone benefited from. She organized Ethan Carter's schedule with breathing room between meetings, not enough to draw attention, just enough to keep him from spiraling when the pressure stacked too tightly. She placed a cup of chamomile tea on his desk at precisely 9:15, steam curling gently, the same way she always did, because she had learned that caffeine sharpened his edge while warmth softened it. When he paced during calls, she adjusted the blinds to reduce the glare that made his jaw clench, and when his voice dropped too low, too controlled, she slid a note onto his desk that read simply, "Take a breath," written in her neat, calm handwriting. Ethan noticed these things even when he pretended not to. He noticed how the office felt steadier when Lily was there, how the air seemed to move differently, less charged, and how her presence anchored him in ways quarterly reports never could. He did not ask why she knew these details, because asking would require admitting he needed them, and need was a language he had trained himself to forget. Still, something in him responded, unbidden, each time her voice cut through the noise with quiet clarity, each time she spoke without fear or flattery, grounding him back into the moment. Late one evening, long after the last assistant had left, Ethan remained in his office staring at a spreadsheet he had not processed for nearly an hour, the numbers blurring, his chest tight for reasons that had nothing to do with business. Lily appeared in the doorway with a light knock, not intruding, just present, asking if he wanted the summary printed or sent digitally, giving him a choice when the rest of his world demanded certainty. He surprised himself by asking her to stay a moment, not for work, but because the silence felt too heavy without her steady presence. They spoke briefly, carefully, about timelines and priorities, but beneath the words lived something unspoken, a fragile truce forming where tension had once lived. Lily mentioned, almost casually, that pressure without rest often created the illusion of control while actually eroding it, a thought she had picked up years ago during her own struggles, and Ethan listened without interrupting, something he rarely did. That night, after she left, he sat alone in the dim office, the city lights blinking below like distant stars, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to acknowledge the truth he had buried under achievement. Control was not protecting him, it was isolating him, and the fear he refused to name was growing stronger the more he ignored it. Over the following days, he found himself watching Lily more closely, not with authority, but with curiosity, noticing how she never rushed her steps, how she met conflict with stillness, and how her boundaries were firm without being harsh. Lily, in turn, remained professional but present, offering care without surrendering herself, her calm becoming both a comfort and a mirror. Neither of them spoke about what was changing, but the seeds were planted quietly, in cups of tea, in measured breaths, in moments of restraint that carried more meaning than any grand gesture ever could. And in that delicate balance, something fragile and powerful began to take root, waiting for the moment it would be tested. Lily noticed the shift before Ethan did, because she was trained to read patterns rather than react to moments. And the pattern was clear in the way his requests multiplied without reason, how his emails arrived later at night and earlier in the morning, how meetings that could have been delegated suddenly required her presence, her notes, her confirmation. It was subtle enough to hide behind productivity, but persistent enough to feel like pressure, and Lily understood that what looked like reliance was actually something more fragile and dangerous. Ethan began calling her into his office for questions he already knew the answers to, asking her opinion only to dismiss it, and then circle back minutes later, restless, unable to settle, his need for control tightening the more his inner balance slipped. He slept less, worked longer, and the dark circles beneath his eyes grew more pronounced, while his tone remained perfectly calm, too calm, the way people sounded when they were holding themselves together by force. Lily continued her routines with care, not because she believed they would fix him, but because consistency was the only language she trusted. She placed the tea, adjusted the lighting, paced the day with quiet intention, yet she also began drawing clearer lines, pausing before responding to after-hours messages, asking for confirmation before rearranging her own commitments, small acts of self-respect that felt louder than raised voices ever could. Ethan noticed those changes too, and instead of relief, they stirred something uneasy in him. The idea that Lily might pull away, might reclaim space that he had unconsciously claimed as his anchor, unsettled him more than market volatility ever had. One evening, as the office emptied and the city darkened outside the windows, Ethan asked Lily to stay again, his voice neutral, the request framed as work, but the air between them told a different story. He spoke about upcoming deadlines, about pressure from the board, about expectations no one else could possibly understand, and Lily listened, standing across from his desk, hands folded loosely, her expression open but grounded. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes searching, she gently reminded him that carrying everything alone was not the same as being strong, that leadership did not require isolation, and that trust could exist without control. The words landed softly, but Ethan recoiled as if touched, his jaw tightening, his posture stiffening as the familiar defenses rushed back into place. He stepped closer than necessary, not threatening, not aggressive, just too near, his presence filling the space, as if proximity itself could restore order. Lily did not move, but something in her eyes changed, a calm resolve that made it clear she would not yield ground simply to keep the peace. She told him, quietly and clearly, that pressure born from fear would eventually break whatever it leaned on, and that she would not become collateral damage in a battle he refused to name. The room fell silent, thick with everything neither of them was ready to say. Ethan turned away first, the movement sharp, his control snapping back into place like armor, and he dismissed her with a clipped thank you that sounded more like a retreat than a command. Lily left the office with steady steps, her heart racing not from fear, but from the certainty that something had reached its limit. Alone again, Ethan stood by the window, the city lights reflecting back at him, his chest tight, his breath shallow, the truth pressing closer than ever. The more he tried to hold on, the more he felt himself slipping, and somewhere beneath the polished surface of power and precision, a long-buried fear began to surface, whispering that control was not enough to keep him safe, and that the one person who saw him clearly might also be the one he was most afraid to lose. Lily expected the breaking point to arrive loudly, with raised voices or an unmistakable confrontation, but instead it came quietly, late on a Thursday night when the office floor was nearly empty and the city outside pulsed with distant light. Ethan asked her to stay once more, his message brief, professional, framed as a final review before a morning presentation, and Lily agreed because clarity mattered, because avoidance would only delay what was already pressing in. The office felt different after hours, softer and more exposed, the hum of the building settling into a low, steady rhythm as rain streaked the windows and traffic moved far below like a separate world. Ethan stood by the desk when she entered, jacket draped over the chair, sleeves rolled just enough to betray fatigue he could no longer hide, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Lily placed the documents neatly on the table, her movements precise, grounding herself in the familiar order she trusted. Ethan began reviewing numbers, his voice even, but his focus fractured, sentences trailing, his attention slipping back to her presence as if it anchored him against something unseen. She corrected a figure gently, pointed out a margin that needed adjustment, and he nodded, grateful and unsettled at the same time. The air between them tightened as the silence stretched, filled with unspoken awareness, and when Ethan finally spoke again, it was not about work. He asked how she managed the pressure, how she stayed calm when everything demanded more than it gave, the question escaping before he could restrain it. Lily answered honestly, saying she learned to listen to her limits because ignoring them had once cost her too much, and that strength, to her, meant knowing when to stop pushing. Ethan stepped closer as if drawn by the certainty in her voice, his usual composure faltering, the distance between them shrinking until Lily could feel the warmth of his presence without being touched. She did not step back, not because she misunderstood the moment, but because fear had taught her that retreat only fed imbalance. She held his gaze, steady and open, and said quietly that pushing people past their limits did not create loyalty, it created fractures, and that she would not be another fracture in his life. Something in Ethan broke then, not violently, but completely, the defenses slipping as his breath hitched, his control evaporating in the face of the truth she held up to him. Without planning it, without intention rooted in desire or impulse, Lily closed the small remaining distance and pressed a brief, gentle kiss to his lips, not claiming, not demanding, simply present. The contact was light and fleeting, but it landed with the force of revelation. Ethan froze instantly, his body going rigid, breath catching as panic surged through him, his hands lifting reflexively before falling back to his sides, his eyes wide with something raw and unguarded. He stepped away abruptly, turning as if the room itself had tilted, his chest tight, his breath shallow, the polished calm gone. Lily did not follow, did not apologize, did not reach out. She stood where she was, her voice soft and steady as she said she was not trying to cross a line. She was showing him one, and that what scared him was not intimacy, but the loss of control it demanded. The silence that followed was heavy and honest, filled with the echo of everything Ethan had buried beneath achievement and authority. He finally spoke, voice low and strained, admitting he could not breathe, that being close made something inside him collapse, and that control was the only thing that had ever kept the fear at bay. Lily listened without judgment, understanding now that the kiss had not been an invitation, but a mirror, reflecting the wound he had never named. She told him gently that fear exposed was not weakness, and that healing required choice, not force. Then she gathered the papers, her movements calm, and told him she would see him in the morning, leaving him alone with the truth that one quiet moment had revealed, a truth that would not be undone. Ethan did not sleep that night, and when dawn crept across the skyline, It found him still seated in his office chair, jacket untouched, tie loosened, staring at the faint reflection of his own face in the glass, as if it belonged to someone he no longer recognized. The kiss replayed not as a moment of closeness, but as a sudden collapse of the walls he had built so carefully, exposing a fear he had never given language to, a fear that did not roar, but whispered that closeness always ended in loss. When Lily arrived that morning, earlier than usual, carrying herself with the same calm resolve, Ethan felt his chest tighten again, not from panic this time, but from the weight of what remained unsaid. He asked her into the office with a tone stripped of command, the request almost tentative, and she agreed, standing across from him with steady eyes that invited honesty without demanding it. Ethan spoke slowly, choosing words as if each one carried consequence, admitting that control had not been about efficiency or excellence, but about survival, about keeping everything predictable because unpredictability once shattered his world. He told her about the accident years ago, not in graphic detail, but in fragments that mattered, the late-night call, the hospital hallway that smelled of antiseptic and fear, the moment he realized that love could disappear without warning, leaving silence where warmth had been. He confessed that since then, closeness felt like standing on unstable ground. That touch reminded him of everything he could lose, and that power had become his shield against grief he never processed. Lily listened without interrupting, her posture open, her expression grounded, understanding that this was not a confession offered lightly, but a truth uncovered by courage he was only beginning to find. She told him gently that fear made sense when wounds went unattended, but that burying pain beneath control only passed it on to others, and that healing required facing what had been avoided, not mastering it. Ethan lowered his gaze, his voice breaking slightly as he admitted he had crossed lines not because he wanted to dominate, but because the idea of losing her presence had triggered the same old terror of abandonment, and that realization frightened him more than being alone ever had. Lily responded with clarity and compassion, saying that understanding his fear did not excuse harm, but it opened the door to accountability, and that any connection built on control would eventually crumble. She told him she cared about him as a person, not as a position, but that care required boundaries, honesty, and a willingness to seek help beyond her presence. Ethan absorbed her words in silence, nodding slowly, the truth settling in with a heaviness that also carried relief, because for the first time, his fear had a name, and naming it made it feel less absolute. He asked her what healing looked like, not as a strategy, but as a human question, and Lily answered that healing began with choosing support, with therapy, with patience, with learning to sit in discomfort without trying to manage it away. The conversation ended not with resolution, but with mutual understanding, a quiet agreement that something had shifted permanently. Lily returned to her desk, her professionalism intact, her boundaries clear, while Ethan remained by the window once more, not hiding behind the city this time, but allowing himself to feel the unfamiliar sensation of vulnerability without rushing to suppress it. For the first time, he did not reach for control. He reached for awareness, understanding that the fear exposed by one gentle moment was not a weakness to conquer, but a truth that demanded care, and that the path forward would require choices he could no longer avoid. Lily made her decision quietly, the way she handled most things that mattered, without drama or announcements, because she had learned that clarity did not require spectacle. 2 days after their conversation, she requested a brief meeting with Human Resources, her voice steady as she explained she needed to take an extended leave, citing personal reasons and professional boundaries, choosing her words with care so they could not be twisted or questioned. When she informed Ethan later that afternoon, she did not frame it as an ultimatum or a punishment, but as a necessary step for her own well-being, explaining that healing could not happen while imbalance remained, no matter how honest their conversations had become. Ethan listened in silence, his face unreadable, but the impact landed hard, a sharp hollow forming in his chest as the reality of her absence became tangible. He nodded, thanked her for her professionalism, and said he understood, even as every instinct in him screamed to regain control, to negotiate, to fix, to hold on. Lily spent her final days tying up loose ends, leaving detailed notes, organizing files, preparing the team so her absence would not create chaos, because that was who she was, someone who left things better than she found them, even when leaving hurt. On her last evening, she cleared her desk slowly, placing personal items into a small box, the plant she had kept alive by the window, the notebook filled with careful handwriting, reminders of routines that had once anchored more than just a schedule. Ethan remained in his office, watching the lights dim across the floor as people departed, the sound of drawers closing and footsteps fading marking time in a way numbers never had. When Lily finally paused at his door to say goodbye, there were no promises exchanged, no dramatic confessions, just mutual acknowledgement of something real that could not survive without change. After she left, the office felt cavernous, every sound amplified, every absence glaring. In the days that followed, Ethan tried to bury himself in work, filling every hour with meetings and decisions. But without Lily's quiet structure, the cracks widened. He snapped at colleagues, lost focus, forgot details he once mastered effortlessly, and the board noticed, concern replacing confidence in their eyes. More unsettling than professional consequences was the silence that greeted him at the end of each day, the lack of grounding presence, the absence of small rituals that had kept him balanced without him ever realizing how much he depended on them. He replayed her words again and again, about boundaries, about accountability, about choosing support, and for the first time, he did not dismiss them as emotional abstractions. He felt the cost of avoidance in his body, in the tightness of his chest, the shallow breaths, the restless nights where sleep refused to come. Lily, meanwhile, adjusted to a slower pace, returning to routines that had nothing to do with power or pressure, caring for her mother, taking long walks, reminding herself that stepping away did not mean abandoning compassion, it meant honoring it. She resisted the urge to check messages, to monitor what was happening back at the office, trusting that distance was necessary for both of them. Weeks passed, and the separation did what proximity never could. Ethan reached a point where control no longer soothed him, where success felt hollow without connection, and the fear he had named refused to be ignored. He scheduled an appointment with a therapist, not because anyone demanded it, but because he could no longer pretend that strength meant enduring alone. Sitting in a quiet room far from glass towers and city views, he spoke words he had avoided for years, confronting grief and fear without armor, realizing that leadership without self-awareness was fragile at best. As he began that work, slowly and imperfectly, Ethan understood something essential. Lily had not left to hurt him. She had left to give him the space to choose change freely. And for the first time, instead of reaching for control, he considered reaching out, not to reclaim what was lost, but to prove, through action, that he was willing to become someone who could meet her without fear. Ethan's approach changed the way he once approached risk, not with bravado, but with preparation and humility, understanding now that healing could not be rushed or performed for an audience. Therapy became a standing appointment on his calendar, not hidden, not excused, treated with the same respect he gave board meetings, because he was learning that leadership extended inward before it ever reached others. He listened more than he spoke, sat with discomfort instead of managing it away, and allowed silence to exist without filling it with control. At the office, changes followed, not as grand declarations, but as consistent actions. He restructured meetings to allow voices other than his own to lead, delegated without hovering, and acknowledged mistakes publicly when they happened, setting a tone that startled those who had grown used to his rigid precision. The board noticed the shift, not just in numbers, but in atmosphere, a steadiness replacing tension, productivity growing from trust rather than pressure. Weeks passed, and when Ethan felt ready, he requested time on the agenda of a company-wide meeting, standing before hundreds of employees with no script to hide behind. He spoke plainly, acknowledging that his leadership had crossed lines, that excellence achieved through fear was not excellence at all, and that he was committed to building a culture rooted in respect and accountability. There were no excuses, no references to stress or expectations, just ownership and a clear outline of changes already underway. The room was silent, then thoughtful, and finally filled with quiet acceptance, a beginning rather than an end. Only after that did Ethan consider reaching out to Lily, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with respect for the distance she had claimed. He wrote a message carefully, not asking for forgiveness or return, but offering an apology without condition, acknowledging the harm he had caused and the work he was doing to ensure it would not be repeated. He told her she owed him nothing, that her boundaries were valid, and that he hoped she was well. Lily received the message on a calm afternoon, sunlight filtering through her apartment window as she folded laundry and listened to the quiet rhythms of a life she had reclaimed. She read the words slowly, noting what was present and what was absent, the lack of pressure, the absence of need, and she allowed herself to sit with the response rather than rushing to define it. Days later, she agreed to meet, choosing a public cafe near the river, neutral ground where power held no advantage. When Ethan arrived, he did not reach for control or familiarity. He greeted her simply, thanked her for meeting him, and listened as she spoke about her time away, about what she needed to feel safe and respected. He did not interrupt, did not defend himself, and when he spoke, he shared not progress as proof, but process as truth, the ongoing nature of his work, the awareness that change was not linear. Lily watched him closely, attentive to the spaces between words, the ease with which he accepted accountability without collapsing into guilt or reaching for reassurance. She told him she appreciated the apology, that trust would take time, and that any connection moving forward would require clear boundaries and equality. Ethan agreed without hesitation, understanding that this was not a negotiation, but a foundation. When the conversation ended, there was no promise of what would come next, only a shared understanding that something had shifted from fear to choice. As they parted, Ethan felt lighter, not because he had regained something lost, but because he had released the need to control the outcome. Lily walked away grounded, knowing that healing did not mean returning to what was, but honoring what had changed. And in that mutual recognition, something quiet and honest took shape, not as a guarantee of love, but as proof that growth, when chosen freely, could create space for something real. Ethan and Lily did not rush toward a conclusion, because both of them understood now that endings built too quickly often carried the seeds of new harm. So they let time do its quiet work, meeting occasionally in neutral places, walking along the river, sharing coffee without expectation, allowing trust to form through consistency rather than intensity. Months passed, and the changes Ethan had begun deepened, not because Lily was watching, but because he had learned to watch himself. The company evolved with him, policies rewritten, leadership redistributed, the culture shifting from pressure to purpose. And for the first time, Ethan felt pride not just in success, but in sustainability. Lily returned to professional life on her own terms, accepting a role outside the company that aligned with her values, where her voice mattered without proximity to power, and that independence strengthened rather than weakened what grew between them. When they finally spoke about what they were becoming, it was not framed as rescue or redemption, but as choice, two adults acknowledging that connection was possible because fear was no longer in control. One evening, as the city settled into dusk, Ethan invited Lily to a small rooftop garden he had helped fund quietly through a company initiative focused on mental health and employee well-being, a space designed not for status, but for pause. The air was cool, the lights soft, and there was no audience, no performance, just honesty. Ethan told her that loving her had never been about possession, and that he would rather risk uncertainty than return to control, because fear had taken enough from him already. Lily listened, her expression calm, her heart steady, recognizing the difference between words meant to persuade and words meant to stand alone. She told him she chose him not because he had changed for her, but because he had changed for himself, and because that choice made room for partnership rather than imbalance. Their closeness grew naturally from there, marked by respect, patience, and an understanding that healing was ongoing, not a destination reached and forgotten. When Ethan asked Lily to build a life with him, he did so without spectacle, without rings or crowds, simply asking if she wanted to continue choosing each other with honesty and care, knowing that love was not proven by grand gestures, but by daily integrity. Lily said yes with a quiet smile, not because the future was guaranteed, but because it was mutual. They built their life intentionally, separate careers, shared values, clear boundaries, and a commitment to return to conversation whenever fear threatened to resurface. Ethan never forgot where he had come from, and Lily never forgot the strength it took to walk away when staying would have cost too much. Together, they demonstrated that leadership could be compassionate, that love could exist without control, and that true power was not found in dominance, but in the courage to be seen fully and still choose connection. In the end, nothing about their story was loud or dramatic, but it was deeply transformative, a reminder that healing does not erase the past, it reframes it, turning fear into awareness and pain into purpose. Ethan learned that breathing freely mattered more than standing above others, and Lily learned that standing firm made space for love that did not ask her to shrink. Their story did not conclude with perfection, but with balance, two people moving forward not as savior and saved, but as equals, committed to a life where fear no longer dictated the shape of love.